On this episode, we look at the second half of George Foreman's career. And I think in the mid 1980s, no one, least of all George Foreman, thought they would be seeing the big man back in the ring again. And yet, that's exactly what he did. In a total defiance against the odds, in a total defiance against his close friends and relatives, and against ageism, George Foreman made a return to the squared circle. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and put a comment down there. It really does help the algorithm. And if you're just listening on the podcast, then let us just proceed to Big George, One for the Ages, Part 2.
Before the existence of written records, humans systematized combat. From prehistory and into the modern day, martial arts have been a part of the fabric of culture and civilization. Whether as a means of self-protection, or to wage war, or to compete, or to preserve a tradition, or to touch personal greatness, these codified methods push us to ask questions, to explore, to express, to test, and to tell stories. This is Jamie Club's podcast, the official podcast of Club Chimera Martial Arts, where we take the path of the vagabond warrior to find knowledge and inspiration from people, events, and ideas. If you are interested in where to follow Jamie Club and Club Chimera products and services, please wait until the end of the show. In the meantime, if you think this product is worth the price of a cup of coffee, please click on Support the Show in this episode's show notes.
Although he did not officially retire from boxing, George Foreman made it quite clear that he wasn't going to face Ali again, and the two became friends. Part of Foreman's life change was also put down to his decision to spend more time with his family. He divorced his first wife, Adrienne Colquhoun, and mother of his first 6 children the same year he stopped fighting and began preaching. It was also the same year he married Cynthia Lewis, although they divorced in 1979. His marriage to Sharon Goodson lasted for 1 year. They were divorced in 1982 when George married his 4th wife, Andrea Skeet. They were divorced in 1985, and George married for a 5th and final time to the woman who would be with him until his death, Mary Joan Martelly. Not long after this point, funds were beginning to run low. The youth centre that bore his name needed more money. Determined to continue carrying the baton he believed Lyndon Johnson had passed to him, George initially used the youth centre as just a place for youngsters to hang out in and keep off the streets. He soon introduced a boxing programme in addition to other sports, and made a conscious effort not to evangelise but leave the door open for his church once he felt the kids had got themselves together. The centre did well, but by the mid-80s George said it was taking every dime he could get. A tour of other ministries yielded more funds, but after one minister made a strained plea for his congregation to donate more to the centres, Foreman stated he never felt more ashamed in his entire life. The money he had made in the 70s was gone. George had a huge family to support. Furthermore, his sense of self-respect was now on the line. He made a conscious decision never to ask anyone for money again. The only way he knew how to bring money in, the money that was needed for his family and the centre, was to do the unthinkable. He had to fight again. In fact, he decided, he wasn't just going to fight. He was going to regain the heavyweight championship of the world. The idea was met with resistance at first. His wife was horrified at the prospect, and his children couldn't even remember seeing their father skip rope or hit the heavy bag. Yet Big George was adamant. He stepped onto the scales. 315 pounds, he would later exclaim. I thought, oh Lord, I need better scales. George was no longer the fighting fit exemplification of athleticism the world had marvelled at in the previous decade. Whatever he had lost in physicality, Foreman was going to have to do his best to make up for in wisdom. Taking the Lao Tzu proverb at face value, he began his metaphorical 1,000-mile journey back to professional fighting with a single step. His eldest son, George Jr., recalled how even before his father began jogging, he started walking. He dropped pennies, quite the most apt of symbolic gestures given his motivation, at different points on his trek to to measure his progress. Besides the eventual support of his family, Foreman went back to the beginning for belief in his boxing abilities. He sought out Doc Broadus, the Job Corps counsellor who had first encouraged him to take up boxing and coached him during those initial years. Back in the gym, it quickly became apparent that Foreman needed to drastically alter his style of fighting. When he was a young, phenomenally gifted athlete with tremendous power, Dick Sadler had done what most trainers do with natural sluggers: work the style around the knockout punches. This was not going to carry a man in his late 30s who hadn't fought for a decade. Like all older fighters, he needed a strong concrete defence. When he fought before, his style was somewhat reminiscent of Dick Sadler's cousin Sandy. Foreman used a long guard to control and manipulate his opponents, taking full advantage of his strength and reach. Like Sandy Sadler, who was nicknamed the Stick, George looked even more like a giant playing with mere mortals in the ring when he used this method. His great pouring slap-down parries were used to pull down guards, whilst his collar ties in posting broke their balance, all the better to land crushing blows with his fists. This was not going to work for him now. He still possessed frightening force in his number one punch, the Liston-inspired power jab, his straight right that gave him so many of his knockouts, and his pulverizing walking uppercuts. But the long guard was no longer a viable base to throw these from. It offered too many risks now. The weight of his extended arms slowed down head movement and presented opportunities to be blindsided as good counter-fighters could take advantage of angles. If none of these factors were big enough for Terence to change his approach in his late 30s, then the energy consumption required to maintain outstretched arms was clearly the privilege of a younger, lighter fighter. According to old school wisdom, power is the last thing to go. That might have been the case with George Foreman, but one thing all of us quickly discover is that the ability to take damage, or more specifically recover from that damage, diminishes pretty damn fast. Therefore, it was apt that Big George would adopt ancient Archie Moore's cross-arm guard. During Foreman's heyday, two of his great contemporaries, Joe Frazier and Ken Norton, used variations of this golden era guard. However, it was falling out of favour even then. Looking back, even Archie Moore appeared an oddity in his usage of it back in the 50s. This was a guard that had its roots in the bare knuckle era and continued to be popular in the 20s and 30s. However, the increase of glove size and gradual influence of amateur boxers' more rigid high guards pushed the approach into obscurity. Moore used it at a level of sophistication some have argued has never been equalled. Its strength lies in its fluidity, high level of overall protection, and its conservation of energy. With his huge shoulders and arms, Foreman found it was a natural fit for him. Despite being called muscle-bound and dismissed as a crude, brawling slugger due to reliance on raw power, never better exemplified than in his fight against Ron Lyle, Foreman was fascinated by the art of boxing. His adoption and adaptation of the cross-arm guard revealed he was far more sophisticated than many had thought. "Boxing is like jazz," George once said. "The better it is, the less people appreciate it." There was little in the way of appreciation for Foreman's much publicised return. A predictable storm of derision permeated the airwaves. One commentator viewed his return as the best argument for why boxing should be abolished. Experts scoffed at the prospect that a fighter could return after a 10-year layoff, let alone expect to rise to the top of his profession. World Boxing magazine could not have been more scathing with its cover story, George Foreman's flabby comeback. The same magazine went further with its subheading, "The Blob That Ate Sacramento," it declared, referencing the venue of where Big George was to make his comeback. Writing off the man's return to boxing that many were now calling shameless, crazy and a disgrace, the same article stated, quote, "After a few bruised eyelids, Foreman's comeback will fade away," end quote. It was a view initially shared by respected journalists like Wallace Matthews, who saw this renewed career decision to be little more than a spectacle. Even when George knocked out journeyman Steve Zewski, didn't impress the naysayers. The fourth round comeback victory was described by Matthews as a laugh track type of attraction, noticing how he now seemed to lumber around the ring. Foreman had cut down to 267 pounds, a considerable feat but still 42 pounds heavier than his heaviest when he had been in his prime. Nevertheless, George took the barbs and he took on 4 more opponents that year. Demonstrating his knockout power, he stopped Charles Hostetter in round 3, Bobby Crabtree in round 6, Tim Anderson in round 4, and finished out the year with a 3rd round technical knockout over Rocky Sikorsky. Sikorsky may have been a journeyman, but he was a pretty active one, whose most recent highlights was a 6th round knockout victory over former heavyweight champion Leon Spinks. Now comfortable with his new style of fighting, George Foreman began to make a more accurate assessment of his current abilities. In face of the lumbering criticism, which was probably biased by the image of his size, weight and age, George was still quite mobile. This didn't mean his balance hadn't diminished. Another factor noticed by many as they face middle age is a gradual decline in equilibrium. Foreman discovered that although he could land sledgehammer blows as well now as he ever did, these weren't going to come in the form of rapid combinations anymore. Fighting against opponents with the speed of Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali, Foreman was never going to be seen as fast by comparison. But he had always been capable of landing sharp combinations. Now these heavy punches cost him balance and had to be switched for precise single punches. He was still going to be a slugger, but like Max Schmeling in the 1930s, he would be a calculated one. Embracing his new style had provided Foreman with a surprising new benefit: stamina. What the likes of Wallace Matthews had mistaken for being a slow and lacklustre approach to fighting was actually a far more relaxed style. Like the old mongoose Archie Moore, who resumed advising him from the sidelines, George Foreman learned that the cross-arm guard defence offered a far more relaxed approach. Now he found he could fight for 12 rounds with relative ease. Yet even with his self-belief, there was little doubt the ageing Foreman was re-entering a world that had moved on in a big way. Only Larry Holmes was a visible reminder of Foreman's era. He was the same age and had remained active, doing everything that was expected of him as a world champion with many successful title defences. However, once the title was wrestled from him in 1985, the same year Foreman had thought about returning to the sport, Holmes was considered long past his sell-by date. He will still fight on for another 17 years, but never reclaim his past glory. When the youngest man to claim the world title and the now undisputed world champion Mike Tyson demolished Holmes in round 4 of their bout, there couldn't have been a clearer mark made that the old era was done. Perhaps the biggest indication of this to Foreman was the fact that all his old rivals had all since been retired. Foreman had even appeared in retrospective documentaries and on chat shows with them. Ken Norton, Joe Frazier and Muhammad Ali all hung up their gloves in the same year, just 4 years after Foreman had his epiphany and left the sport. Frazier's second knockout defeat at the hands of Foreman had been his penultimate fight. He'd attempted a comeback 5.5 years later against former convicted murderer Floyd Jumbo Cummings, who'd go back inside 22 years later for armed robbery. The bout was seen as part of a trilogy set to give Smokin' Joe a shot at the WBA world title the following year, then held by Mike Weaver. The fight was a disaster and resulted in a controversial draw. Frazier was a bloodied mess, whose only real moment of glory occurred in round 2 when he was able to land his patented scything left hook. His reactions were clearly gone, and referee Nate Morgan even stated, quote, "Jumbo nearly knocked him out. Joe's too old to be fighting anymore," end quote. Blind in one eye and with bad vision in the other, Frazier was a tragic figure. He tried and failed to live through his son, who did not have a successful professional boxing career, and many critics have later remarked he would have done a lot better if he hadn't tried to emulate his father's style. He once said that George Foreman was, quote, "one of the nicest fellas I ever met," end quote. However, despite the smiling amiability he showed in retirement, whenever he appeared on televised shows against his old rivals, Frazier continued to harbour deep resentment and bitterness for Muhammad Ali. Ali would express regret for the pain his pre-publicity insults and campaigns had caused Frazier, a proud fellow African-American who had fought his way up from poverty to the pinnacle of the world, only to have his own neighbourhood turn against him when he was labelled as an Uncle Tom or apologist for white America. This had been made all the more painful by the fact that Frazier had helped and supported Ali during his exile from boxing, only to be betrayed by the verbal campaigns he waged against him, especially when Ali brought race into the argument. Muhammad Ali had also retired from boxing within the same year and month as Frazier. On the surface, it would appear that his fate was more tragic. When Ali made his own comeback, he also altered his style. With reduced speed, he had brought in the rope-a-dope strategy that had defeated George Foreman. During this time, the greatest had also discovered he had a very good chin. It would give him back his glory, but at a very high cost. His fights now were often wars. After the devastating thriller in Manila that had concluded his bitter trilogy of bouts against Frazier, 7 of his 10 remaining fights would go the distance. 6 of those fights were punishing 15-round title affairs. The worst of these, which some consider to have been even more damaging than the Manila fight, was against the hard-hitting Ernie Shavers. Shavers may have never won the world title, but his 76.7% knockout rate was comparable to Foreman's record, and puts him in the history books as one of the heaviest punchers in the sport. With a highly influential and well-paid entourage of sycophants in his ear, Ali would ignore the pained pleas from his longtime physician, Ferdy Pacio, to retire. After informing everyone about Ali's condition, Pacio quit prior to the champion losing the title by unanimous decision to Leon Spinks. Ali surprisingly won back the belts in a rematch, but the early signs of Parkinson's disease were already beginning to show. After becoming the first man to win the world title 3 times, Ali retired. However, financial pressures returned him to the ring on 2 occasions that made Frazier's sad last hurrah look like a celebratory final dance by comparison. First came his bout against his old Zaire sparring partner Larry Holmes for the WBC and now vacant lineal ring title. It was his only stoppage. After 10 one-sided rounds from a reluctant opponent who nevertheless was later blamed for triggering Ali's Parkinson's, despite the fact that the 36-year-old was struggling from vocal stutters and trembling hands, Angelo Dundee stepped in the ring and ordered the referee to stop the fight. Despite television interviews such as one held with his longtime friend and verbal sparring partner Michael Parkinson, where he slurred his words, Ali fought one last time in a 10-round match against Trevor Berbick. The fight took place in Nassau in the Bahamas, because no American state would grant Ali a license due to what had happened in the Holmes fight. He was promoted by convicted felon and member of the Nation of Islam James Cornelius. The entire event was a total shambles, from misplaced keys to the unfinished venue, to slow ticket sales, to the fact that both boxing gloves and a cowbell had to be procured for the fight at a last minute's notice. Ali lost to a unanimous decision. Even he admitted he was too old and slow this time around. George Foreman, who had had his own rage and depression issues with Ali, had been able to forgive his old opponent. In fact, he often said that he considered his humbling Rumble in the Jungle defeat to be one of the best things that happened to him. When Ali received his Parkinson's diagnosis, they became like brothers. Foreman would later state there was no one he was closer to than Muhammad Ali. In fact, long before Foreman decided to make a comeback, Ali was encouraging him to return. George had rebuffed the idea. He was a minister now. Ali had countered, "Remember what David did to Goliath? You can come back and fight for God." Everything about the new George Foreman seemed to be a total counter to the man from history the boxing world had known. The glaring muscled figure with a close-cropped military haircut, who had few words for anyone back in the day, was now a talkative, self-deprecative, joy of a chat show host. During one such interview, he discussed his conscious physical transformation symbolised by shaving off his head of hair and beard because he didn't like the person he saw in the mirror. His bald head and clean-shaven appearance seemed to round off his once hard and sharp corners. Working as a minister, talking in front of his congregation, promoting his youth club, and becoming a paternal figure of guidance for kids just like him, had made him open, jovial, and more relaxed. Critics scrambled to come up with insults that Big George wasn't already playfully directing inwards, along with a useful quote or soundbite at hand. Meanwhile, his fan base was growing as he became a favourite on cable television. His fights had real appeal. Far from the chiselled bodybuilder physiques that influenced masculinity from action films to sports, Foreman spoke to the chubby middle-aged man and all those who loved them back home. As if to drive the relatable sales point home, George stated that he was showing that 40, a number he was much closer to than 30, was not a death sentence. If anything, the closer he got to this age, the more momentum he gathered towards his goal. 1988 demonstrated the ring rust was coming off, and so was the weight. Foreman stopped all 9 of his opponents inside the distance. This included former 2 divisional champion and future Hall of Fame fighter Dwight Muhammad Qawi. Foreman would get down to 235 pounds, just 10 pounds shy of his old prime fighting weight, but decided he was stronger around the 250 pound mark. Celebrating his 40th year, Big George proved he was far from death row as he continued his ascent. He might have only fought 5 times in '89, but his calibre of opponent was on the rise. 4 of these victories were stoppages again. These included Burt Cooper, who will go on to challenge Evander Holyfield and Michael Moorer for their world heavyweight titles, and even hold a version of the title through the lesser-known World Boxing Federation. These opponents also included former WBC champion J.B. Williamson. Fellow Texan Everett Bigfoot Martin tested George's stamina boast by being the first boxer in the comeback trail to take him the distance. Martin has been called the king of journeymen. His record spoke for itself. Besides an upset of Tim Witherspoon, he was rarely the man favoured by the bookies, except when it came to durability. Big George knocked him down in round 8, but Martin got up. He was still standing when Foreman got the unanimous decision, and even picked the larger man up to honour the win. On the 15th of January 1990, the mainstream boxing critics were shown that George Foreman was far from a small-time novelty interest. He landed his first $1 million payday when he was matched with fellow knockout merchant Jerry Cooney. 24 of Cooney's 28 victories had come via stoppage. Like Foreman, he only had 2 losses on his record. George was heavier at 253 pounds, but Cooney was still 231 pounds, plus was 3 inches taller and still in his prime at 33. Big George was now 41, and the first round had seen him take his first damaging blow since he had resumed professional boxing. Cooney, a left-handed fighter who chose an orthodox stance, stunned his opponent with a hard shot from his dominant fist. However, round 2 was a different story. Despite saying that Jerry was up with amongst the heaviest punches he ever faced, Foreman wasn't displaying any obvious damage. He put the pressure on immediately and took charge of the fight. George's left uppercut found its mark, followed by a series of right hands, and when no answer came, he stuck Cooney with that infamous power jab. A vulnerability spotted by others regarding the big-hitting Jerry style was how he responded when hurt. He didn't see a clinch to tie up an opponent buying time to recover. This cost him dearly with George, who had never been shy about finishing. After just beating the 10 count, the referee ignored the staggering man's condition and allowed the fight to continue. At the 1 minute 57 second mark, Cooney was declared out of the fight after Big George charged in with another left uppercut that sent Jerry face first to the canvas. This time the referee could see there was no point in counting as the fighter was unresponsive. George Foreman had retired him. Now the experts were beginning to ponder questions previously dismissed by the wishful fan theorising. How would Tyson's swarms fare against Foreman's powerful precision slugging? Mike Tyson, who suffered his first loss, an upset knockout to James Buster Douglas the month following Foreman's victory over Cooney, would tell a very excited Don King, quote, "If you love him so much, you fight the motherfucking animal." End quote. Following the upset, efforts were made by King to get a rematch with Douglas, even offering the new champion more money than he had ever received for a fight. But Buster decided he would give the number 1 contender, Evander Holyfield, the opportunity. Tyson's defeat would prove to be Douglas's one-hit wonder. Lacking the unique motivation that drove him to train for and defeat Mike Tyson, Buster put on 15 pounds and was easily outmatched by Holyfield. The challenger avoided a telegraphed uppercut in round 3 and floored the champion with a straight right. Buster lay sprawled on the canvas as referee Mills Lane counted him out. Evander, the real deal Holyfield, became the first undisputed cruiserweight champion to win the undisputed heavyweight title. Tyson and King were immediately at his door. Iron Mike hadn't been idle following his loss. In June, he knocked out old amateur boxing rival Henry Tillman, who had taken his Olympic spot by a first-round knockout. He finished the year out by doing the same to Alex Stewart. According to his autobiography, Becoming Holyfield, Evander said He really wanted to fight Tyson. Even after his loss to Douglas, he was still the man to beat. Nevertheless, Holyfield's manager, Lou Duva, the man responsible for guiding the Real Deal to his world heavyweight title, believed that it was better to delay the Tyson fight in favour of another popular contender. He believed Holyfield could win the fight, which he was offering the champion an astounding $20 million for, and then make the inevitable Mike Tyson fight an even more lucrative payday. The popular fighter in question was someone who had just earned his place as the number 10 contender, Big George Foreman. With a further 4 early knockout victories since the Cooney fight, George was still doing well. However, it was his sheer popularity that convinced Lou Duva. For a time, the Battle of the Ages, scheduled for the 19th of April that following year at Boardwalk Hall in Atlantic City, New Jersey, became the highest grossing boxing event in history. The fight went the distance and Holyfield handed Foreman his first loss on the comeback trail. However, the champion's victory was less applauded than the challenger's valiant efforts. The fat jokes and old man jibes seemed thin now. George had made his way to the top and he was still standing when the final bell rang. Round 7 had seen him knock Holyfield off balance and then absorb a 15-punch combination. After the fight, Evander was complimentary to his opponent, who he said pushed him into some very difficult situations and gave him some good shots. However, he denied he was in any real trouble. Many years later, Evander will joke about being hit so hard by George prior to the end of the round that he took a while to get back to his corner. When he did, he had to ask if he still had his teeth. For many, this was an honourable ending to the revised story of George Foreman. It fitted nicely into the Rocky mythology. The valiant loser. This was redemption. George proved enough to the critics to have got as far as he had done. There were smiles at Foreman's kind words to Holyfield. Quote, "If I had to lose, I'm glad it was to such a fine gentleman." End quote. His own self-regarding lines of, "I didn't retreat, did I? I kept fighting all night. My legs were so strong and I wanted the senior citizens to know I didn't need any advantages. I didn't sit down at all, though that mule kicked me a few times and I wanted to lie down," were probably met with the same humouring directed at an over-the-hill father. Dear old George. You did well, but this will be the last time you will see any of these belts. You've made a fortune. It's time to retire again. Except it wasn't. George Foreman ended 1991 with a third-round technical knockout of retired American football star and now professional boxer Jimmy K. Ellis. This was followed by one of Mike Tyson's recent victims, Alex Stewart. Most expected this to be another easy victory for the determined Foreman, and matters looked like they were going that way by round 2 when Stewart went down twice. However, it appeared that this effort had not left a lot in the tank for George. He began to tire and absorb punishment from Stewart, who was given time to recover and got a second wind. Foreman squeaked a majority decision despite sporting a bloodied and swollen face at the conclusion of the fight. After an 8-month break, George returned to the ring on the 16th of January 1993 to retire Pierre Coetzer with an 8th round stoppage. With his popularity still high, the WBO decided to give him a chance to fight Tommy the Duke Morrison for their now vacant World Heavyweight title. Although the belt was not considered as prestigious as the WBA, WBC and IBF versions, it was gaining a lot of recognition in the 1990s thanks to the success of a number of fighters in the lighter divisions. During the early 90s, the WBO belt was treated as a temporary position for heavyweights who waited for an opportunity to go for the more respected titles. Once it appeared likely that a WBO champion could challenge for any or all the main 3 versions of the titles, or even fight for the top contender spot, they would abandon their responsibilities to the World Boxing Organisation's mandatory challenger by dropping that belt like it was on fire. Consequently, after Morrison's first shot at the title resulted in his first career loss and a knockout to Ray Mercer in round 5, Mercer would vacate the title after this single title defence by taking on the other ageing ex-world champion of that era, 42-year-old Larry Holmes. The winner of the bout could challenge Holyfield for the coveted undisputed title, represented by the WBA, WBC and IBF belts. Mercer had underestimated the wily Holmes, who outjabbed him to a points victory. It will be 10 years before Mercer gets another title shot, and it will be for the belt he abandoned to Michael Moorer and Burt Cooper to contest. Ray, now the veteran on the scene, will be stopped in the 6th round by its current holder and future IBF, IBO and WBA champion Vladimir Klitschko. Mercer will retire with a record of 36 wins, 7 losses and 1 draw. Purely for the interest of listeners to this particular show, Ray Mercer is worth noting for being one of the few world boxing champions who would venture outside of his chosen combat sport to try his hand at other professional martial arts. He will also attempt careers in both K1 rules kickboxing and mixed martial arts. He lost both of his kickboxing matches, demonstrating how little he had prepared for kicks. He lost the first to a decision to Musashi and the second within 22 seconds of the first round after he was shaken by a head kick by Remy Bunjaski and verbally conceded the fight. His debut in MMA against underground street fighting legend Kimbo Slice would also demonstrate his unpreparedness for submission grappling when Slice tapped him with a guillotine choke. His second and last MMA fight will happen in 2009, winning him respect by handing former UFC champion Tim Sylvia his first knockout defeat. Back in 1992, and Tommy Morrison had not been idle. Morrison, who rose to fame playing the main antagonist in Rocky V, rebounded from his loss to Mercer with 8 straight victories via stoppage. The Duke was a slugger with one of the best left hooks in the business. His fight with Foreman was expected to be a violent toe-to-toe war at the Thomas & Mack Center in Paradise, Nevada, and was dubbed the Star-Spangled Battle. However, what audiences got was a tactical fight orchestrated by Morrison. Rather than bringing his youthful exuberance to Foreman, who had learned to counter strongly off his cross-arm guard with power shots, Morrison fought off the back foot. Foreman was forced to come forward, where Tommy could use his superior agility to angle off and score sharp punches before retreating. Despite being the 7-5 favourite, Foreman was once again deprived of any sort of World Championship glory. The Duke snatched a unanimous decision victory. Prior to the fight, George had announced that this would probably be his last bout. He had managed his expectations. The need to fight for financial reasons had diminished. He had made more than enough to look after his huge family and fund his youth centre. Another career was beckoning Big George, that of the celebrity. Seeing his obvious charisma, writer Norma Safford Vella, along with 3 production companies, decided to exploit this aspect of the new emerging national treasure. From 1993 to 1994, ABC aired George, a situation comedy about a retired boxer who runs an after-school program for troubled kids. However, the show failed to win over critics or audiences. With the unenviable distinction of scoring a 0 rating on Rotten Tomatoes, the overall consensus was that George Foster could not live up to George Foreman. As one critic put it, quote, "George is better being George than playing George." End quote. We have only to look at Foreman's old rival and now friend for a similar situation. 3 years after defeating Big George to regain the world title, Muhammad Ali was a very active champion, and yet still had time to play himself in a biopic called The Greatest. Although the film received mixed to positive reviews at the time of its release, later it will be dismissed as a curio that pales in comparison to most documentaries made on Ali, such as aka Cassius Clay, released in 1970 and mentioned in Part 1, and the Oscar-winning When We Were Kings that will be released in 1996. However, 1994 offered one prospect to cash in on George's celebrity that would secure his and his family's future for good. In the early 1990s, Michael Bohm created an indoor grill that could cook both sides at once. As a secondary benefit, the device removed the fat content from meat products like hamburgers by draining it away into a separate reservoir. Its floating hinge and slanted grilling surface further allowed for accommodating foods of different thickness. Partnering with engineer Bob Johnson, the pair manufactured a grill they first called the Fajita Express and pitched it to several companies and trade shows. Little interest was shown until one of the companies, Sultan Inc., made a few structural modifications and decided to pitch it to colleagues of George Foreman. The grill was then sent directly to the big man to test. George agreed to endorse Bohm and Johnson's invention. He fronted it in commercials with the new title, The George Foreman Lean Mean Fat Reducing Grilling Machine, or the George Foreman Grill for short. The combination of the grill's unique features and Foreman's personality made for a winning formula. However, Big George had unsettled matters. His loss to Tommy Morrison had not given him the closure he wanted. Rather, it had reignited a fire in his soul. It had been over a year now since he'd attempted to go for that consultation prize and fail. When he first went down this path in his late 30s, few people took him seriously. He'd proven them all wrong for a while. However, now he was 45. The Mike Tyson match wasn't going to happen. Despite winning a further 2 knockout victories, a rib injury had delayed the much anticipated matchup with Evander Holyfield. Then Tyson's conviction for raping model Desiree Washington removed him from the picture altogether. The world was changing yet again. New players were on the scene. Tyson's contemporary, Lennox Lewis, has proven to be a late bloomer and now holds the WBC belt. Michael Moorer, not Evander Holyfield or even Riddick Bowe, was in possession of the other 2 major belts. When Foreman issued his challenge, he was almost halfway through his 3rd decade in boxing, a decidedly young man's sport, where he was no longer just facing a new era of fighters, but at a point when those particular fighters were now becoming the old guard. For Moorer, fighting such a popular fighter was a guaranteed big payday. However, Foreman had other obstacles to overcome. Whereas the IBF had been happy enough to reinstall Big George as their 8th ranked contender, the WBA weren't so happy. George Foreman wasn't in their rankings, and they did not agree to sanction the bout, stating that if Moorer proceeded with the event, he'd be stripped of their title. The fight was cancelled. However, Foreman hadn't got this far in life without tenacity. Along with his promoter, Top Rank's Bob Arum, Foreman sued the WBA on grounds of age discrimination. This was a fight George would win. The presiding judge agreed that the WBA had acted capriciously in not sanctioning the bout. So long as the Nevada medical authorities cleared him, the organisation had to allow George Foreman to fight for their title. It's the 5th of November 1994, and George Foreman is putting on his red shorts. They're nothing special to look at, but to Foreman, they're a reminder of an event that humbled him like no other. Just over 20 years ago, on the 30th of October 1974, Big George suffered his first loss and the only knockout on his record at the Rumble in the Jungle. An older man, making his 2nd attempt to reclaim his old title, taught him a lesson. That older man, Muhammad Ali, has his old trainer, Angelo Dundee, in George's corner this time around. This was the same man who'd helped orchestrate the rope-a-dope strategy that allowed Big George to outbox himself. Foreman, now a minister and a proven show business personality, can't help but see the near poetry. He would later recall the day he won the heavyweight title a year prior to the Ali fight. Quote, "Man, that Joe Frazier, I was afraid of him, and when they stopped the fight in the 2nd round after 6 knockdowns, I just couldn't believe it. Suddenly I was thinking of John L. Sullivan, Jack Dempsey, Jersey Joe Walcott, Muhammad Ali. You could feel the spirit of those people running through you." End quote. There is a story that the shorts George Foreman wore on the night he challenged Michael Moorer for the title were the exact same ones he had been wearing in Zaire. Perhaps it's a myth, but George has become a devout student of self-belief and an unashamed romantic. After he beat Joe Frazier back in '73, Everlast manufactured a series of trunks for him with the tag, "Specially made for George Foreman, heavyweight champion of the world." George still had a couple of pairs and made the decision to wear them with this self-affirmation, "When I go into the ring this time, even though I'll be introduced as the challenger, I'm going to feel like the champ." Foreman waits in the dressing room, going through the strategy for tonight. If not with Dundee, then in his own mind. One thing he has learned since that fateful night in Zaire is that a good plan can go a long way when everything else is against you. Even though the bookies have Moorer as the slight betting favourite, an HBO commentator has described Foreman as the gazillion-to-1 underdog, the tail of the tape doesn't look good for Big George. Moorer is 26, with an undefeated record of 35-0. Among these scalps is the man Foreman was unable to dethrone. No small achievement, given Evander Holyfield's past and future record. As if to add this shadow to the large one already cast by Zaire, Moorer vs. Foreman partially borrows its title from the Battle of the Ages, the fight that had given Foreman his first loss since his comeback trail. his first loss since losing to Jimmy Young, which had brought his first part of his career to an end, and the loss that seemed to have signalled the limitations of his dream. The fight's title is the more minimalistic One for the Ages. Mora was 10 years old when Foreman lost the title, and he was about to take his first steps into the boxing world. Training at the legendary Kronk Gym, Mora came under the tutelage of the great Emanuel Steward, who guided him through a brief amateur career. Unlike George, it was decided Mora turn professional rather than try out for the Olympic team. This proved fruitful, with Double M gaining the WBO light heavyweight title in his 12th professional fight before jumping 2 weight divisions to fight in the more lucrative heavyweight arena. However, there was still enough in Mora that perhaps reminded Big George of his old self. After winning the heavyweight version of the WBO title, he parted company with Stewart, becoming more autonomous in his decision-making and determined to take charge of his career. He became aloof and difficult to connect with. Outside his camp, he didn't have many friends either. Much like the morose Foreman of yesteryear, Mora wasn't an amicable champion. His responses were often short, curt and defensive. No reporter could warm to him as they did with Holyfield and Lewis. It's often forgotten that even Mike Tyson, the scariest champion since Foreman, was often smiling, laughing and even childlike during his interviews. Mora exhibited no charm. He was very much the angry yet silent young man going into this fight. In professional wrestling terms, he was an easy heel to Foreman's well-received babyface turn. However, all the crowd support that once had carried Ali and was now under Foreman wasn't going to change the fact he was facing a sharp young fighter in his prime. Mora was also a southpaw. He was the first southpaw to win the world heavyweight title. Southpaws possess one advantage over orthodox opponents. They have more experienced fighting boxers who stand left side forward than orthodox fighters have fighting them. On the surface, it looks like an early finish might be George's best option. He can use his great strength and power to take advantage of certain weaknesses. Mora's fights with the ever-durable Everett Bigfoot Martin and Bert Cooper had revealed certain flaws. Engaging in a slugfest, Martin had knocked Mora down for the first time, exposing his lack of defensive skills. These skills were tested again in his next fight with Cooper for the WBO belt. Although Bert Cooper would lose to a 5th round knockout, he sent Michael to the canvas twice. Given that these defences come up short against counters, Foreman can form a plan. He can push the fight early to get Mora into another slugfest, at which point George can put his effective countering skills off his cross-arm guard to good use. The doors open. It's Joe Cortez, the referee for the fight. There's been a last-minute change, Cortez tells Foreman. The 3 knockdown rule has been wavered. Mora had gone down before, but he had never stayed down. Rather, he'd got up to win the fight. Now the plan to jump on him early did not seem like such a great idea. Memories of expending too much energy when he had knocked Alex Stewart down twice come to mind. Foreman had only just pinched that victory on a decision while sporting a lot of facial damage. Stewart was a journeyman. Mora had stopped in round 4. Gambling everything on heavy shots in the early rounds could cost George dearly. The plan needed to change. From round 1, the age difference was apparent. Mora was swift-footed and sharp with his combinations, taking charge early on. The criticism that plagued Foreman when he first mounted his comeback was now back in the commentary. HBO second analyst, commentator and veteran boxing coach Jill Clancy spends most of the fight criticising Foreman's place as a legitimate threat. Big George might have had the audience behind him, but the boxing experts are tired of this prolonged spectacle. Foreman has tried and failed. Tonight is his funeral. As the early rounds progress, Mora tees off with his right-hand jab. The cross-arm guard catches most of them, but it's not indestructible. Punches find their way in, as the precision striker has the luxury of greater speed. Meanwhile, the challenger keeps a deliberate and patient pace. He takes the textbook approach orthodox fighters are advised when facing southpaws. Angle your stance with your left foot on the outside of their lead foot. This brings him in closer, where he has the best chance to land his heavy shots. Despite scoring with a few telling blows in round 3, Foreman knows he has to be sparing with them. HBO lead analyst commentator Larry Marchant scoffs at what he calls the myth of George's power. Dundee and Foreman have agreed on a steady pace. The pressure has to be just enough not to exert George, but to bait Mora. However, it's taking its toll. Round after round go the champion's way. Round 6 sees Foreman hurt Mora again. It appears the tide might be turning in the following round, but it's a short-lived moment as the champion rebounds. Foreman consoles himself that it's not time yet. In round 8, George lands another good right hand, but doesn't follow through. A serious mistake in the eyes of the commentators. By round 9, it would appear that time is now running out. Foreman hasn't gone down yet, but that is not Mora's strategy. His work is plain to see on the ageing heavyweight's face. Foreman's left eye has almost swollen shut. Although the champion has slowed down quite a lot, he's carrying far less weight than his opponent. In a war of attrition, no matter what Big George has said about having better stamina this time around, youth had the upper hand. The scorecards give Michael Mora the comfortable lead. Jerry Roth and Chuck Giampa had it 88-83 in favour of the champion, with Mora winning 7 rounds to Foreman's 2. Dwayne Ford also gave 7 rounds to Mora and 2 to Foreman, but scored it 86-85. Now in the latter stages of the fight, Michael Mora is headed for his first successful title defence. Teddy Atlas, Mora's coach, is not so convinced. His regular vice has been to stay on the outside and avoid Foreman's right hand. It's a position that Michael hasn't much cared for of late, allowing George to take it instead. However, Teddy has seen through Foreman's strategy. The older man has been drawing the champion into close-range exchanges. This is when he landed the damaging blows in rounds 3 and 6. Mora is running at his pace. George is setting Michael up with some quick-fire combinations. These are starting with Big George's number 1 punch, the jab, which he's using to break down Mora's guard before landing a right cross. He needs to be savvy to this game. George didn't set the pace. It was plain to see the champion is ahead. He needed to pull back and make Foreman come to him. By contrast, Angelo Dundee can see that a knockout is the only way Foreman can win this bout. He's been patient enough. The moment has arrived. As Fight Post will write in 2023, quote, Foreman entered the ring to, if I had a hammer, now he needed one, end quote. Michael Mora just needs to stay away and play defence. However, since the day he parted company with Emmanuel Stewart, he's been his own man. His choices have got him this far, and his problems with his current coach will become their own stories. Some have criticised Teddy Atlas's speeches at ringside to be attention-seeking. Maybe Mora thinks the same. Regardless, Michael is facing an opponent that looks hurt. Whatever his old-school tactics have been, Mora isn't scared of them. Teddy's been listening to his old mentor Customodo too much, the peekaboo master who forced his students to watch and re-watch endless footage of old fighters. Foreman was an old man sporting visible damage. Besides, Michael is tired now. He doesn't want to be hitting and running for the next 3 rounds. He can match the old guy's pace. As round 10 begins, the commentary concerns how far ahead Mora is now, and Foreman needs to pick up the pace. With Dundee's advice now out there, they call back to the Larry Holmes fight when the same advice was being offered to another aged ex-champion. The exchanges begin. Foreman lands an early body shot. Mora stays in range and Foreman appears to be returning to his older style. A long guard is present as he begins to paw and manhandle his lighter opponent. A lead hand right, the exact same punch that so enraged Foreman at the Rumble in the Jungle, stuns the champion. A wild left hook then finds its mark. Mora keeps up the work rate, defying Atlas's orders as he mixes it up with the challenger. As Foreman continues to pressure him into the exchanges, the champion fires a series of sharp jabs that find their mark, but so does another solid-sounding left hook from Foreman. Mora punches back and takes yet another left hook to the head, sending one of his legs out, but he regains his balance in an instant. It's given begrudging credit by the commentators, but they don't think Mora is impressed. He has felt the power of Foreman, what is left in a fight where the challenger is so far behind. To say Michael Mora totally disregards Teddy Atlas's advice is not accurate. For the most part of round 10, he is continuing to match Foreman. However, now he appears to be taking some of Teddy's advice and begins moving to his right away from that dreaded right hand. Meanwhile, despite holding a low opinion of George Foreman's chances, the commentary team have noticed that Foreman has unveiled an hitherto unseen weapon in answer to Teddy Atlas's strategy, a sharp left hook to the head. These shots are punishing the champion now and herding him back to the inside and directly into the pathway of Foreman's straight right. The first one lands a little too high. Foreman adjusts, working his reinstated long guard. He sets with the left again and drops the right flush on Mora's chin. And Double D plummets to the ground to the total shock of the commentators as he lies on his back. As Cortez begins the count, the audience and HBO's talking team scream in utter amazement with cries such as, "The miracle that no one thought possible." George Foreman, standing in his neutral corner, takes a single glance towards heaven, turns to the post, kneels and prays. For years afterwards, the fight will be dissected. Fight Sport will hold a controversial view that Foreman wore down his opponent. Alden Chodash is far down the other side of the argument. Mora, the judges and commentators, only thought he was controlling the fight when the real ring generalship was Foreman's. Mora, ever the petulant youngster, will dismiss the defeat as little more than a lucky punch. There was no strategy, he just took his eye off the ball. Years later, he will confess to being exhausted in the 10th round. Regardless of anyone's views, George Foreman has achieved what he had set out to do back in the mid-80s, and much more. He was now the oldest man to win the World Heavyweight Championship, breaking the record set by Jersey Joe Walcott in 1951. But it was his journey of redemption that so endeared him to his fans, new and old. Foreman wasn't just a poster boy for body and age positivity. He was proof that people could change and grow. Thanks for listening to Big George, One for the Ages. That's the end of this two-part story. However, stick around after these messages to hear what's coming up on the next episode of the Jamie Club podcast. Thanks for listening to the show. If you're so inclined, there are many ways you can express your support and help keep this podcast going. For example, I've published several books on Amazon. If you'd like a signed copy of any of them, please drop me an email. You can also purchase my online Vagabond Warriors martial arts cross-training courses and the online Animal Instincts Children's Self-Protection Teaching Programme. More direct support can be shown through Buy Me a Coffee and my Patreon page. I'm most grateful to all those who have already bought my books and courses and those who continue to kindly donate to the show. As for my services, the heart of all that is CCMA, nowadays I teach private lessons, courses and seminars. These are bespoke services that put you in charge of your martial arts journey. I teach self-protection and martial arts cross-training. You can train with me, one-to-one, or in a small group. I count individual clients, couple clients, parent and child clients, and various other combinations. These can be taught face-to-face or virtually. I also regularly teach clubs, societies and associations nationally and internationally. Please go to clubchimera.com for more details. Please don't forget to subscribe to the show on whatever podcast platform you are currently using. If you could leave me a 5-star rating and a review, I would be most grateful. You can also follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky, X and TikTok. Facebook also has a members group in addition to the main business page, so please send in a request to join in with the training discussions and be a part of the wider CCMA community. I'm also uploading new content to YouTube. There are various shorts, vlogs and full video versions of some of these podcast episodes on there. Again, please subscribe, like, share and leave a comment. All favourable engagement helps keep CCMA moving forward. In the next episode of the Jamie Club podcast, we switch boxing for Muay Thai as we go to Patong, Phuket, for details on the shows I watched live over there and some of the story of the different rule sets of the ever-changing world of Muay Thai.